So you and we're about to go on a little adventure together. That adventure is going to span 118 years of Tudors, and it's going to be one generation at a time. How does that sound to you? I'll be your host this evening. My name is Christina. Thank you for joining us here at my Tudor Era Tapestry. Most of the estate affairs of William Willoughby had been settled. The king had far more royal wards than he could reasonably track, let alone guide. The crown had the option to sell these wardships to other nobles. Kit's wardship had been sold. The king was no longer responsible for Kit. 9-year-old Kit was now the responsibility of Duke Charles Brandon. Charles had decided Kit was going to reside with the Brandon family. Kit already knew the Brandon children. The youngest child, 4-year-old Henry Brandon, had been her betrothed for several years. That had been one of the reasons Charles had been made her guardian. In the German principality that Anna called home, her sister was gone. She was married and living with her husband. It had all happened so fast. Anna was aware that she might very well be the next daughter married off. At 13, married life felt like it was sneaking up on her fast. Anna's brother had not been with the ladies recently. He was 12 years old now and a man grown. William had to learn from his father how to be a German prince someday. The work was demanding. John was in the midst of consolidating his lands. He had his own lands combined with his wife's lands, and the land he had acquired more recently. John only had one son, William. Everything would be so much more simple if the land was consolidated into one unit. William was right by his side, learning how to rule. Court life was not exactly what Princess Mary Tudor had remembered. King Henry was seeking a divorce. Queen Katherine was not agreeing to the divorce. Mary was unsure and uneasy about how this argument would turn out. Sometimes Lady Pole would try to distract her with a game, but she would notice. She pretended for dear old Lady Pole. She was trying so hard. Mary was 12, and she heard whispers about her father occasionally. She had heard some theories about the estrangement. Some people thought Queen Katherine had never gotten over the Henry Fitzroy issue. They said she had harbored bitterness about the illegitimate son, especially because she never had a surviving son herself. Another theory was that Henry was unhappy that Katherine never had a boy, and he wanted to get remarried again. Mary was sorry she had not been a boy, but there was nothing she could do about that flaw. The whispers said that he was interested in her mother's lady, Anne Boleyn. Mary liked Lady Anne not. She was not a princess. She was not fit to be queen. In other marriage news, new talks about Mary's future were abound. These talks centered on Mary marrying another cousin, this one on her father's side. Mary's cousin, James V, King of Scots, was in need of a queen. James was 4 years older than Mary, at 16. She was still warming up to the idea of being Queen of Scots. Her Aunt Meg had done it, but from what Mary had heard, it was not a gentle journey. This marriage could happen as soon as talks went through. At 12 and 16, both parties were of legal marriageable age. The sweating sickness had swept in like a malicious phantom. There was no way to know who could catch it or why. It was fast, and it was clever. Rumors had reached London that it had arrived, and everyone who was able reacted. While people died in the city, Lady Anne Boleyn had retreated to her family home of Hever Castle. It was painful to leave the king. He had insisted that they separate for their health, but that did not make it any better. Anne missed him. It mattered not. Anne caught the sweating sickness. It had found her at Hever. Her father had written to the king to inform him of Anne's dire state. Henry had been on the run. If he did not stop moving from place to place, the sweating sickness could not catch him. Every night was a new dwelling. He was worried about Anne. While he needed his own doctor with him to help with constitution-improving tonics and potions, he had other doctors. The recovery happened just as swiftly as the illness had settled in. Anne was alive, and she had the king and his doctor to thank. Anne knew at that moment that King Henry had saved her life. As the illness abated, an old face appeared back in London. Henry Percy had been made Warden of the Marches back in December. After the death and loss of the epidemic, he had received leave from the king, from his duties, to return back to the city for a short while. Seeing him was no different for Anne than if she had seen a ghost. He was still handsome, of course, but he looked older now, worn down. Anne had heard through whispers that his marriage had completely broken apart. There were accusations. Mary had accused Earl Henry Percy of poisoning her, his own wife. She said she had been very ill, and it had not been the sickness that had swept through. He wanted her dead, and she did not feel safe. Henry had said he was not poisoning his wife. She was, in fact, spying on him and paranoid. He was the victim. He could not trust his wife. People took sides. The marriage had completely devolved. Anne was 27 years old. She should have several children of her own by now, but she was in love with an already married king. Still, that was preferable to whatever the Percys had going on that they called a marriage. "1528 was a dreadful year. Lady Catherine Carey was a fatherless 4-year-old. Cathy's lord father had died of the sweat. Her lady mother had nursed him, but to no avail. William succumbed to the illness that had swept across the countryside so quickly. Word had arrived later that both Lady Mary's brother George and her sister Anne had caught the sickness also, but they had survived. This did not help with the sting of William's loss. What was his family to do without him? How would Mary, former mistress to the king and sister to his new favorite, care for her family? June of 1528 had been miserable and terrifying. The sweating sickness had covered the court. People were getting sick everywhere. It had hit the Boleyn family particularly hard. George had been ill with a sickness, and Lady Jane Boleyn had spent long hours nursing him back to health. She had worried for him. He had been so close to death. She thought surely he would recognize all of the effort that she had put in to keep him alive. He would realize how quickly life could be taken, and he would focus more on their lives together. He had no one else to care for him. Janie had been the only one he could rely on that summer. Anne had left court. The king had ordered it to keep her safe, but Anne had gotten ill anyway. She had come down with the sweat at Hever, where her family's staff had cared for her with her worried parents nearby. King Henry had been so worried he had sent one of his personal physicians to care for her. With Janie so focused on George and Anne's parents so focused on Anne, there had been little thought put into Mary and her young family. Mary's husband William had also caught the sweat this summer. Mary had nursed him, and for a short time it looked like he may be recovering. But he had drifted off to sleep, and that had been a death sentence. William never woke again, and Mary had become a 29-year-old widow and mother of 2 very small children. It had broken Janie's heart to hear about Mary's plight. What was Mary to do? How would she provide for her young family? Surely she would need another marriage arranged once the appropriate mourning period had passed. Janie was so thankful her husband had recovered. So far, she had not noticed a change in George's affection, but his eyes had softened when he heard that both of his sisters had survived the epidemic. When George was much recovered, he had received a promotion. King Henry had been so pleased to return to a healthy court and be reunited with Anne that he had made her only brother esquire of the body. George would be in the king's inner circle. He would spend most days with the king and fulfill any emergent security needs that may come up. Janie would miss him when he was away, but maybe these new duties would make him feel more secure in their marriage and their household funds. Maybe George would see fit, after 4 long years of marriage, they could finally have a baby. There was no hiding from the sweating sickness. If it wanted to find you, it would. It had found Mary Brandon on her estate far away from court. She had been very ill. Her family had thought she would die. Many people had died. There were whispers. The sweating sickness had been introduced to England when Mary's own father had invaded with his French army 43 years earlier. Some had said it was only right that his children and grandchildren would catch it. Mary had survived the sweat. She had not been a healthy woman for some time. It was a surprise she had survived at all. She was not recovering completely. The sweat had left her weaker, even weaker than before. Charles had been wonderful. He'd been away with the king during the height of the sweat. Once he had heard that she had been ill, he had rushed back home as soon as he was able. It had taken some time to get word to him, and even longer for him to get leave from the king and return. He arrived eventually, and he had some good news. The Brandons had been secretly married 13 years previous. They had married in secret without the permission of anyone. They had not cared. They wanted to be together even if it meant their marriage was not entirely legal. The king had eventually given in, but the church was a murkier decision. Charles had been reaching out in an attempt to remedy this church situation. He had returned with a papal bull, issued by the Pope himself. The marriage of Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor had been recognized by the church. 13 years after their secret marriage, everyone who mattered agreed their marriage was legitimate. No one could say anything different. Mary, in her weakened state, was at peace. King Henry had also awarded Charles and Mary a wardship. The betrothed of their son had lost her father. She had become a baroness, but was still a child. Her mother was still alive, but she was a full-time lady-in-waiting for the queen. She was also Spanish and had no idea how to train her young daughter how to be a working English baroness. Because the girl would marry their son, she had moved in with the Suffolks. Mary would raise her alongside her betrothed, and Charles would run the duchy until his son and Lady Katherine were able to do it themselves. An additional child to raise would add more to Mary's already full load, and she was so ill. But this was her duty as a noble mother. The Parr household was deep in preparation for the wedding of their eldest daughter. The wedding was approaching quickly, and there was much to be done. Lady Katherine Parr would need to be fitted for an entirely new wardrobe. Decisions would have to be made about what she would bring with her and what things would stay at home. She had already argued about several books that she wanted to bring. Her mother had told her the horses were already overburdened, and she would have to bring less books. Kat was not sure that she wanted to marry, but she would be 17 next year. It was time. Every time her mother returned from court, she would sit with Kat and they would discuss wedding plans. The contracts needed to be read and signed, and her dowry paid. Kat's things had to be packed up and shipped to her new home. She needed to say goodbye to her brother and her sister. Once she moved on to her new life, she did not know how long it would be until she saw them again. Her mother had already secured a place for Anne at court as lady-in-waiting for the queen. Kat was trying to fight her envy. She could not go to court because she was preparing for marriage. Anne was only 13 and still had time. Kat thought back to when she was 13. She would have loved a court adventure. She had heard news from the cooks. Edward's mad grandfather had died. Edward's father was the new baron. Catherine wondered if Edward would be willing to tell her the tales of his grandfather, the mad baron. It seemed to Lady Catherine Howard, at the age of just 4, that it was very dreadful to be poor. Her mother had died, and her father had gambled away any money that could have laid her to rest properly. Her mother was gone, and there was no one left to take care of her. She managed to survive by blending in with the older Howard children. They were not as capable of care as her mother, but they knew how to get food, even when her father was away, hiding from the family's extensive debts. The letter that Kate's father had sent to Cardinal Wolsey had come to nothing. As far as she knew, he had not even responded. There had been talk about sending the smallest Howard children to the widow of their grandfather. Agnes had been much younger than Kate's grandfather, and she was living off his grand estate. She had taken in several of her husband's poor relations, and it looked like Kate had no choice but to join them. The sweating sickness had ripped through the city and countryside so fast no one was safe. Countess Margaret Pole was happily tucked up in Wales again and felt much safer. She had been heartbroken to learn that her son Arthur had perished in the outbreak. The illness had taken him so quickly. Maggie was already writing to his widow. Jane must not remarry. She needed to put Maggie's grandchildren first. She would also write to a convent. That was what Maggie had done when her husband had died all of those years ago. There was no time to mourn. Maggie had a job to do. She was still guiding Princess Mary. During the outbreak, there had been several visits to remote family estates, but the visits were never as a family. Mary would visit the Queen or the King, never both together. This year at court had been a tough one. There were several factions that Jane had heard whispered rumors about. She had not known how hard it would be to navigate in reality. Sides had been chosen, and Jane just had to pick one. She had chosen the Queen, of course, but sometimes that was lonely. Most of the ladies her age had chosen the other faction. The sweating sickness had recently come through. Jane had been spared, hidden away with the Queen. It had hit Wolf Hall hard. Jane had lost her brother Anthony and her sister Marjorie. They were gone with God. Jane had wept and said her prayers for their souls. Many of the ladies had lost family members. One of the ladies, Janie Boleyn, had to nurse her husband from the brink of death. His sister, Anne Boleyn, had caught the sweat herself. She had survived, but lost a brother-in-law. Jane had thanked God that the King, Queen, and the princess in Wales had been spared. She would miss Anthony and Marjorie. They were with God, and she would see them again. She had not heard anything really from William. Maybe he had moved on, crushed finally by his mother's expectations. She did not feel like she had time to waste. Jane had reached her 20th year. If she wanted a large family, and she did, she would need to find a husband rather swiftly. The spring of 1528 had been so picturesque and perfect for a wedding. Margaret Tudor, Dowager Queen of Scots, was getting married for the 3rd time. She knew no other way of picking a husband other than choosing the one with the most potential for her political and military support. Henry Stuart had added the potential of being a good and loyal friend. Meg thought that this marriage was so much better than her second marriage to Archibald. With her first marriage, she was still a child. Meg had married Henry Stuart on the 3rd of March, 1528. Her future with Henry felt secure. She preferred Stuart's to Douglas's. Just after 2 months of newlywed bliss, a fantastic surprise showed up on Meg's doorstep. King James, now 16, had escaped Douglas custody. He had run straight to where he had resided with his mother, Meg. She was happy to see him and invited him straight inside. Meg was not sure if they had the support to fight off the Douglas clan, but for now she had physical custody of her son, and that was progress. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, was corresponding with several people who were keeping her apprised of the goings-on of the realm and beyond. She used to discuss such matters with her husband, the king. Those conversations did not happen anymore. Henry did not seek her advice or her company anymore. He was spending time with his new fixation, Anne Boleyn. Catherine had heard from her loyal informants that her nephew, King James V, had escaped captivity up north. He had run straight into the arms of his mother. Catherine hoped in the same circumstances her own child would know to do the same. Catherine was on her side above all others. News had arrived at the convent where Marie of Guise resided with her grandmother. The king's sister had gotten remarried. Marguerite d'Angoulême had married the King of Navarre. She was a queen now. Marie had heard the whispers. The King of Navarre desperately needed an heir. His kingdom was being taken over by the Holy Roman Emperor, so King Henry was rallying with his northern neighbor of France. Marguerite was the bolt holding this alliance in place. Marie wondered if she would hold that place soon, a bolt of an alliance. Her uncle, the Duke of Lorraine, was looking for an alliance to place Marie into. She was only 14, but she was very tall for her age and looked older than her 14 years. Her marriage was going to happen soon. She just had to wait to see who she would marry. The wedding of her Aunt Marguerite had not changed much for 8-year-old Madeleine of Valois. She lived in the valley with her aunt and her sister. King Henry of Navarre was in and out of their lives. He was busy ruling his diminished kingdom. The Holy Roman Emperor, as the King of Spain, had been invading Navarre. He had taken a lot of their lands. When he was not in Navarre, he spent a lot of time in France. The kings of both kingdoms had been fighting against the emperor together. They had been captured together at the Battle of Pavia, and now they were brothers-in-law. Marguerite would often head to Paris to see her husband. King Henry was only 26 years old. Marguerite was a bit older at 36, but Henry needed heirs. This was Henry's first marriage, and he had no heirs to rule Navarre after him. Marguerite had no children with her first husband, and she seemed to be at peace with that choice. This marriage was different. Marguerite was pregnant with the first heir of Navarre. She was expecting her baby at the end of the year. The bundle of joy would arrive just before Christmas. Lady Dorothy Stafford had become a big sister to little Lord Henry. He was cute, but could do little else than sleep and cry. She was only 2 years old, but she could already see that Henry was the jewel of her parents' crown. He was a boy and an heir. Dorothy knew that she was loved and wanted, but she was not the heir they had needed. Henry could take care of the family when he was older. The family had been rebuilding their reputation and their fortune. Dorothy's father had been admitted to Gray's Inn as a lawyer. He had been dealt a hard blow, losing his inheritance when his father had committed treason. He was going to build it back as best he could. The Staffords would need to be respected again. The Poles were respected. Dorothy's lady grandmother was a countess, the governess to Princess Mary. Princess Mary was the heir to the throne, even if she was a girl. Countess Maggie took care of her every day. That must be why she wore such fine gowns. Dorothy's uncle, Reginald, worked for Princess Mary's Lord Father, the King. He was attempting to help the King search for a divorce. The King had a great fondness for Uncle Reginald. The Poles were not without loss. Dorothy's Uncle Arthur had perished earlier this year when the sweating sickness had descended like a phantom. Her lady mother had cried for her brother for a long time after she received the news. Dorothy went to bed that night thinking of her lady grandmother Maggie, with her fine jewels and sweet smell. Someday, Dorothy would like to be a grand lady like her. In the midst of November, Marguerite, Queen of Navarre, was deep in her childbed pains. At the age of 36, she had decided she would probably not have children. Her first husband had been a complete dolt. Marguerite had not wanted children with him. She was still not sure, but for her second marriage, she had married a 25-year-old king. He needed an heir. His kingdom was under heavy attack by the emperor, and he had lost much territory to Spain. The tiny kingdom of Navarre was thankful for the French alliance and desperately hoped for a male heir. When Queen Marguerite delivered her baby, it was not the hoped-for boy. Princess Jeanne made her entrance with a strong cry and a healthy body. Marguerite was not disappointed. She had always preferred the company of women to men. Her daughter would be a strong, intelligent, independent woman. In France, women were not allowed to rule, but in Navarre, there were no such restrictions. This tiny baby girl was the heir to the throne of Navarre. Marguerite's brother, King Francis, wanted his niece to be strong. His own daughters had suffered from frailty. In order to keep the princess safe, her uncle ordered garlic be applied to her lips and a sip of wine administered to the infant. Now they would all wait to find out if their tactics had worked. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. Slide into my DMs on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast, or join the party on Patreon, where we have extended episodes and bonus content.